What happens when a young man inherits a kingdom he never asked for and power he does not understand? 1 Kings chapter 1 describes the chaos surrounding David's death, and the question everyone whispered was not about who would be king, but whether anyone could fill David's sandals. Most people assume Solomon simply inherited a throne and ruled with ease, but history shows us a terrified young man standing at the edge of an impossible task, knowing that one wrong decision could destroy everything his father built. In this investigation, we will walk through 3 movements. First, we will see the moment Solomon realized the crown was heavier than gold. Then, we will explore the choice he made that would define his entire reign. And finally, we will trace how that single prayer set in motion both his greatest triumph and his ultimate fall. And once we understand this first layer, the real story begins. The day David died, Jerusalem held its breath. The city that had danced when the ark arrived now stood silent. Solomon was young, perhaps 20 years old, perhaps younger. Ancient texts do not give us his exact age, but they give us something more valuable. They show us his fear. Scripture tells us that Adonijah, Solomon's older brother, had already tried to seize the throne. Blood had almost spilled in the palace courts. Political rivals circled like wolves. Foreign nations watched for weakness. And in the middle of this storm stood Solomon, a young man who had never led an army, never governed the province, never faced the brutal realities of ancient kingship. His father David had been a warrior, a poet, a man who killed giants and danced before God. The people loved David. They sang songs about him. They told stories about his courage. But Solomon was different. He was the son of Bathsheba, and everyone remembered how that relationship began. Whispers followed him through the palace halls. Some questioned his legitimacy. Others doubted his strength. The elders of Israel gathered at his coronation, but their eyes held questions, not confidence. Could this untested youth really lead the nation? Could he defend them against enemies? Could he make the hard choices that kingship demanded? Solomon felt the weight of those questions. 1 Kings chapter 3 tells us he went to Gibeon, one of the high places where Israel worshipped before the temple existed. He went there not to celebrate, but to sacrifice. 1,000 burnt offerings. Scholars debate whether this was one massive ceremony or accumulated offerings, but the point remains clear. Solomon was desperate. He knew he was in over his head. The throne room felt like a trap. Every decision carried consequences he could barely imagine. Advisors gave him conflicting counsel. Priests watched his every move. The army generals measured his words. And somewhere in the night, alone with his thoughts, Solomon realized something that would define everything that followed. He could not do this alone. He was not David. He would never be David, and trying to become his father would only lead to disaster. So Solomon made a choice that night in Gibeon, a choice that seemed simple on the surface but required profound courage. He decided to ask for help, not military help, not political alliances, not wealth or power or long life. He decided to ask God for the one thing he knew he lacked: the ability to lead wisely, the capacity to discern truth from lies, the wisdom to judge between good and evil. And that prayer, spoken in the darkness of Gibeon, would change everything. But here's what most people miss about that moment. Solomon was not just asking for wisdom, he was admitting weakness. In the ancient world, kings did not admit weakness. They projected strength. They conquered enemies. They displayed power. Vulnerability was death. Yet Solomon stood before God and said the most dangerous thing a king can say: "I do not know what I am doing. I am like a little child who does not know how to carry out his duties. The people you have given me to rule are too many to count. Give me wisdom to govern them well." That prayer was an act of courage, greater than any battle David ever fought, and God heard that prayer. Scripture tells us that God was pleased with Solomon's request, not because wisdom is more valuable than wealth, though it is, not because humility is a virtue, though it is, but because Solomon's prayer revealed something about his heart. He cared more about serving his people than enriching himself. He wanted to rule justly more than he wanted to rule powerfully. He understood that kingship was not about personal glory, but about responsibility. And that understanding, that moment of clarity in the darkness, would become both his greatest strength and, eventually, the standard by which his failure would be measured. But what Solomon did not know, could not know, was that this gift would come with a test. Wisdom always does, because wisdom reveals things. It shows you truth. It exposes lies. It gives you power over others. And power, even power gained through righteousness, carries a terrible temptation. The temptation to believe you are wise enough to handle anything. The temptation to trust your own judgment above all else. The temptation to think that because God gave you a gift, you can use it however you want. Solomon would face that temptation, and the choice he made would echo through 3,000 years of history. If you are intrigued by where this story leads, subscribe now, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about wisdom and power. The night in Gibeon was only the beginning. Solomon received an answer to his prayer, but that answer came wrapped in a mystery. God gave him wisdom, yes, but God also gave him something else, something the biblical text mentions almost casually, but which would become the instrument of his downfall. And once we see what that gift really was, we will understand why Solomon's story is not just ancient history. It is a warning for anyone who has ever held power and believed they could control it. Chapter 2. The prayer that changed everything that night in Gibeon. Solomon fell asleep beside the altar. Smoke from 1,000 sacrifices still hung in the air. The smell of burning flesh and incense filled his lungs. And in the space between waking and sleeping, God spoke. 1 Kings chapter 3 records this conversation with startling simplicity. God appeared to Solomon in a dream and said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Stop and think about that for a moment. The creator of the universe, the God who spoke galaxies into existence, offered a blank check to a frightened young king. Ask for anything. Unlimited resources. Infinite possibilities. What would you ask for? Most people would ask for wealth. In the ancient world, wealth meant survival, meant power, meant security. Or they would ask for a long life, for victory over enemies, for fame that would last forever. These were the things kings wanted. These were the things that made sense. But Solomon did not ask for any of them. Instead, he said something that must have shocked even the angels listening. He said, "I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" That prayer reveals something profound about Solomon's character in that moment. He saw himself accurately. He knew his limitations. He understood the magnitude of the task before him. And he cared more about serving well than about personal gain. This is the kind of prayer that pleases God because it reflects the heart God wants in leaders. Not arrogance, not self-promotion, not grasping after power, but humility, service, and a genuine desire to do right by the people entrusted to your care. God's response came immediately. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, "Since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life." Read those words carefully. God promised Solomon unparalleled wisdom, nobody before, nobody after, unique in all of human history. But God also added wealth, honor, and the possibility of long life. The things Solomon did not ask for came as bonuses because he asked for the right thing first. This is a pattern we see throughout Scripture. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Matthew chapter 6 verse 33. Solomon's prayer demonstrated that principle in action. He sought the ability to serve justly, and everything else followed. But here is the question scholars debate. What exactly did God give Solomon? The Hebrew word used here is lev shemaiah, which literally means a hearing heart. Not just intelligence, not just knowledge, but the ability to truly listen, to perceive what is hidden, to understand what lies beneath the surface of words and actions. This was supernatural discernment. The ability to see into the human heart and know truth from deception. It was a gift that would make Solomon legendary, but it was also a gift that required constant connection to God to function properly. Think about what this means. Wisdom is not like wealth. You cannot store it in a vault. It is not like military strength. You cannot display it on a battlefield. Wisdom is relational. It flows from relationship with God. It requires humility to function. The moment you think you are wise enough on your own, wisdom leaves you. And this is the trap Solomon would eventually fall into. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. That morning, Solomon woke up from the dream. Scripture says he returned to Jerusalem, stood before the Ark of the Covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he gave a feast for all his court. What was going through his mind during that feast? Did he feel different? Did he sense the change God had made in him? The text does not tell us, but what happened next suggests that the transformation was immediate and dramatic, because almost as soon as Solomon returned to Jerusalem, his wisdom was put to the test in a way that would make his name famous throughout the ancient world. Two women came to him with a problem that seemed impossible to solve, and Solomon's solution would prove that God had indeed given him something no other king possessed. But before we get to that famous story, we need to understand something crucial. The wisdom God gave Solomon was not just for clever judgments. It was meant to help him lead Israel in covenant faithfulness. It was meant to keep him connected to God's law and God's ways. Deuteronomy chapter 17 contains specific instructions for kings of Israel. The king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. These were not arbitrary rules, they were safeguards. Horses represented military power and the temptation to trust in strength rather than God. Wives represented political alliances and the temptation to compromise faith for diplomacy. Silver and gold represented wealth and the temptation to measure success by material accumulation. God knew that kings would face these temptations, so he gave clear boundaries. And Solomon, in his moment of wisdom, surely knew these commands. He had been raised in David's house. He knew the law. The question was whether his gift of wisdom would keep him obedient, or whether it would eventually make him think he was above the rules. That first day back in Jerusalem, Solomon probably did not think about those warnings. He was focused on the immediate challenges: learning to rule, establishing his authority, proving to the skeptics that God had truly chosen him. And when those two women walked into his throne room with their impossible dispute, Solomon had no idea that his response would be remembered for 3,000 years. He had no idea that this moment would define how the world saw him, and he had no idea that the method he used to solve the problem would reveal both the brilliance and the danger of the gift he had received. Like this video if you are fascinated by what happens when divine gifts meet human nature, because what comes next is one of the most famous stories in the Bible, but most people miss the darker implications hiding beneath the surface. Solomon's judgment was brilliant. Everyone agrees on that. But it also revealed something about the kind of power wisdom gives you. The power to manipulate, the power to deceive in service of truth, the power to play with human emotions to achieve your goals. And that power, used righteously in this case, would later tempt Solomon to use it for very different purposes. The test was about to begin. Chapter 3. When God says yes, two women stood before the throne. Both were prostitutes, the text tells us plainly. Nobody important, nobody with political connections or family influence, just two women from the margins of society with a problem that looked unsolvable. They lived in the same house. Both had given birth to baby boys within days of each other, and during the night, one of the babies died. Now both women claimed the living child as their own. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no way to prove who was telling the truth. In any normal court, the case would be dismissed. But Solomon's court was no longer normal. The first woman spoke. Her voice carried desperation and grief. "My lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I had a baby while she was there with me. The third day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was nobody else in the house but the two of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning, I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it was not the baby I had born." The second woman interrupted immediately. "No, the living one is my son, the dead one is yours." They argued back and forth before the king. The voices rose, anger mixed with anguish. Solomon sat on his throne and watched. He did not speak, he simply observed. And in that observation, his gift began to work. He was not just hearing their words, he was hearing their hearts. One woman's voice carried the sharp edge of deception. The other carried the heavy weight of loss. But how could he prove it? How could he reveal the truth in a way everyone would see? Then Solomon spoke. His voice cut through the argument. "Bring me a sword." The room went silent. Servants rushed to obey. When they brought the sword and laid it before the king, Solomon gave an order that made everyone gasp. "Cut the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other." The courtiers stared in shock. Cut a baby in half. Was this wisdom or madness? But Solomon's eyes never left the two women. He was watching for something. And in the next moment he found it. The first woman, the one whose baby had died, nodded. Her voice was cold. "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two." But the second woman cried out. She fell to her knees. "Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Do not kill him." The difference was instant, obvious. One woman was willing to see the child die rather than lose the argument. The other was willing to lose everything to save the child's life, and that difference revealed the truth more clearly than any evidence could. Solomon pointed to the second woman. "Give the living baby to her. Do not kill him. She is his mother." The room erupted. People who had been watching in horror now understood the brilliance of what they had witnessed. Solomon had not intended to kill the child. He had intended to expose the truth by forcing each woman to reveal her heart. The real mother's love would not allow harm to come to her child, even if it meant losing him. The false mother's pride cared more about winning than about the child's welfare, and by creating a situation where the truth had to emerge, Solomon had rendered a judgment that nobody could dispute. The wisdom of God was on display for all to see. Word of this judgment spread throughout Israel like wildfire. 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 28 says, "When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice." Solomon's reputation was established. People began bringing their disputes to him. His fame spread to neighboring nations. Kings sent ambassadors to hear his wisdom, and Solomon, for his part, seemed to handle the attention with grace and continued humility. He wrote proverbs that reflected deep understanding of human nature. He composed songs. He studied plants and animals. His court became a center of learning. But something else happened during those early years, something the text mentions but we often overlook. Solomon began to accumulate. 1 Kings chapter 4 describes his administrative structure: 12 district governors who supplied provisions for the king and the royal household. Each governor had to provide supplies for 1 month of the year. The amount of provisions was staggering: 30 cors of fine flour and 60 cors of meal, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. Daily provisions for a massive court. Why mention this? Because it shows that even in the early days of wisdom and blessing, Solomon was building something enormous. His court was not simple. His lifestyle was not modest. The machinery of kingship was growing, and it required constant feeding. More officials, more governors, more provisions, more complexity. And complexity requires management. Management requires control. Control requires power. We are watching the seeds of something being planted, seeds that will grow into thorns later in the story. But for now, everything seemed blessed. Everything seemed under control. Solomon was wise. God was pleased. Israel was prospering. Comment below if you have ever received something you prayed for and then wondered if you could handle it, because that is the question hovering over Solomon's early reign. God said yes to his prayer. God gave him wisdom beyond measure, but saying yes to a prayer is not the same as removing the test. In fact, sometimes the gift itself becomes the test. Can you steward what you have been given? Can you remain humble when everyone praises you? Can you remember where the gift came from when it feels like it is just part of who you are? Solomon would face that test, and the first real warning sign came not from a mistake, but from a success. The success was so great, so spectacular, that it would tempt Solomon to believe he could accomplish anything. That success was the building of the temple, the house of God that David had dreamed of, but was not permitted to build. Solomon would build it, and to do so, he would make choices that seemed wise, seemed efficient, seemed blessed by God, but those choices would open a door that should have stayed closed, a door that led to forces Solomon thought he could control, forces that would eventually control him. Chapter 4. The Wisdom Test. 4 years into his reign, Solomon began the project that would define his legacy. The Temple. 1 Kings chapter 5 describes the preparations. Solomon sent word to Hiram, king of Tyre, the same king who had been David's ally. You know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, he could not build a temple for the name of the Lord his God until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. But now, the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is no adversary or disaster. I intend therefore to build a temple for the name of the Lord, my God, as the Lord told my father David. Hiram was delighted. The alliance between Israel and Tyre strengthened. Trade agreements were made. Hiram would provide cedar and pine logs from Lebanon. Solomon would provide wheat and olive oil for Hiram's household. It seemed like a perfect arrangement, peaceful, mutually beneficial, the kind of diplomacy that wisdom produces. But underneath the surface, something more complex was happening. Solomon was learning that building something great requires resources you do not have, requires skills you do not possess, requires reaching beyond your borders and making deals with foreign powers. There is nothing wrong with that in principle. God never intended Israel to be completely isolated, but there is danger in it too. Every alliance carries influence. Every partnership opens doors. And the more you depend on others, the more you have to accommodate their ways, their gods, their values. Solomon thought his wisdom would protect him from that danger. He thought he could take what he needed from the nations around him without being contaminated by their practices. History would prove him wrong. But for now, the work began. Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. He sent them to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. He had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stone cutters in the hills, plus 3,300 foremen who supervised the work. 1 Kings chapter 5 gives us these numbers without comment, but think about what they mean. Over 150,000 men working on this project. Men taken from their farms, their families, their normal lives to serve the king's vision. Was this oppression or national service? Was this wisdom or the beginning of tyranny? The text does not judge, it simply reports. But later, when Solomon's son Rehoboam takes the throne, The people will complain about the heavy yoke Solomon placed on them. The seeds of that complaint were planted here in these early years when the work seemed glorious and nobody questioned the cost. Solomon was building the house of God. How could anyone object to that? But the line between godly ambition and selfish empire building is thinner than we think, and Solomon was walking that line without realizing it. The foundation was laid in Solomon's 4th year. The temple itself took 7 years to build. 1 Kings chapters 6 and 7 describe it in meticulous detail. 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, overlaid with pure gold. Carved cherubim and palm trees and flowers covered the walls. The inner sanctuary, the most holy place, was a perfect cube, 20 cubits in every direction, overlaid with 600 talents of gold. 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high, stood guard over the Ark of the Covenant. Their wings stretched from wall to wall. It was breathtaking. It was expensive. It was a statement to the world that Israel's God was supreme. But here is what most people miss. While the temple took 7 years to build, Solomon's own palace took 13 years. 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 1 tells us this fact almost casually. It took 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. 13 years compared to 7, nearly twice as long for his own residence as for God's house. Does that mean Solomon's priorities were skewed? Not necessarily. The palace complex included administrative buildings, the Hall of Justice, housing for Pharaoh's daughter whom Solomon had married. It was the center of government, not just personal luxury. But it does raise a question. When does building for God's glory cross over into building for your own? When does necessary administration become excessive indulgence? Solomon probably did not ask himself these questions. He was busy. He was successful. Everything he touched prospered. The wisdom God gave him worked in every area: architecture, administration, diplomacy, trade. Solomon's reign was becoming the golden age everyone hoped for. And in the middle of all this success, something happened that the biblical text mentions briefly, but which tradition would expand into a legend that reveals a darker side of Solomon's story. Somewhere during the construction of the temple, Solomon acquired a ring. Not an ordinary ring, a ring with power. The biblical text does not describe this ring explicitly, but Jewish tradition, Islamic tradition, and ancient writings speak of it. The Ring of Solomon. A seal with the divine name inscribed on it. A ring that gave Solomon authority over spirits, over demons, over forces that exist in the space between heaven and earth. Where did this ring come from? Tradition says it was a gift from God, given to help Solomon control the supernatural forces that might interfere with the building of the temple. But here is where we need to be very careful. Scripture is clear about one thing. God forbids his people from seeking power through magic, through mediums, through communication with spirits. Deuteronomy chapter 18 verses 10 through 12 lists these practices explicitly. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. So, if Solomon had a ring that gave him power over demons, where did that power come from? And was using it obedience or rebellion? This is the question the biblical text does not answer directly, but it gives us clues. Because later, when Solomon's heart turns away from God, when he builds altars to foreign gods to please his wives, when the kingdom begins to crack and fall apart, God does not say this is new behavior. God says Solomon has not kept his covenant and decrees. The implication is that Solomon's disobedience had roots earlier than we think. That somewhere in the middle of building the temple, in the middle of all the success and wisdom, Solomon made a choice that seemed right, seemed necessary, seemed blessed. But that choice opened a door to darkness. Share this video with someone who needs to hear what happens when good intentions lead to bad compromises. because we are about to explore the most controversial part of Solomon's story, the ring, the demons, the power that seemed like a gift but was actually a trap. Most Bible teachers skip over this part or dismiss it as legend, but the traditions are too strong, too widespread, too detailed to ignore completely, and when we examine them carefully, we find that they explain something the biblical text hints at but never fully describes. How did Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, end up worshipping false gods? How did the king who built God's temple become the king who built altars to demons? The answer might lie in a ring, a choice, and a temptation that looked like wisdom. Chapter 5. Building Dreams and Summoning Shadows. The temple was rising. Every day, stones were cut and fitted. Every week, the structure grew taller, more magnificent, more impossible. Ancient historians tell us that the construction proceeded in eerie silence. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 7 says, "In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built." This detail is strange enough to make us pause. Why the emphasis on silence? Why the insistence that no tools be heard at the site itself? One answer is respect. The temple was holy ground even during construction. Another answer is practical. Pre-cut stones fit together more precisely, but there is a third possibility that ancient tradition suggests. The silence was maintained because other workers were involved. Workers who did not use tools, workers who moved in shadows, workers who were not human at all. This is where the legend of Solomon's ring enters the story fully, and whether you believe it literally or understand it as symbolic, the legend reveals something true about Solomon's reign. The ring, tradition says, bore the seal of God, the ineffable name. Wearing this ring gave Solomon authority to command spirits, not to worship them, not to serve them, but to compel them to obey. Think of it as a kind of divine delegation of power. God controls all things, including spiritual beings that rebelled against him. And for a specific purpose, the building of the temple, God gave Solomon temporary authority to command those beings to work. The demons cut stones in the quarries. They transported massive blocks. They did the heavy labor that would have taken humans decades. If this sounds blasphemous or impossible, remember that Scripture does speak of God using evil for his purposes. The book of Job shows Satan acting only with God's permission. 1 Kings chapter 22 shows a lying spirit sent by God to deceive Ahab's prophets. God is sovereign over all, including evil. So, the idea that God might permit Solomon to use demonic labor for the construction of the temple, while strange, is not entirely outside biblical precedent. But here is the critical question. Just because God permits something does not mean it is wise to do it. And just because you have authority over something does not mean you should exercise that authority. Solomon believed he was in control. The ring gave him power. The demons obeyed. The work proceeded faster than anyone imagined. But every time Solomon used the ring, every time he spoke commands to spiritual beings, he was forming a relationship. Not a friendship, not a partnership, but a relationship nonetheless. He was learning their names, understanding their nature, hearing their voices, and they were learning about him, his thoughts, his weaknesses, his pride. Demons are patient. They serve when they must, but they always look for openings. And Solomon, brilliant as he was, did not realize he was giving them exactly what they needed. One night, according to the tradition, a particularly powerful demon appeared before Solomon, not in defiance, but in service. The demon's name was Ornias, and he had been causing trouble for one of the workers, a young boy. Solomon summoned Ornias and demanded obedience. The demon had no choice but to submit, but in the conversation that followed, something shifted. Ornias told Solomon about the hierarchy of demons, about princes and powers, about knowledge that humans were not meant to have, and Solomon listened. Because Solomon's great gift was curiosity. He wanted to understand everything. Plants, animals, governance, architecture. Why not the spirit realm too? This is where wisdom becomes dangerous. when it makes you think you can handle anything, when it convinces you that understanding something gives you power over it. Solomon thought his wisdom protected him. He thought his relationship with God was solid enough to explore forbidden knowledge without consequence. He thought he could use evil without being stained by it. And at first, it seemed like he was right. The temple was completed. 1 Kings chapter 8 describes the dedication ceremony. Solomon gathered all Israel. The Ark of the Covenant was brought into the most holy place. The priests withdrew from the holy place, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The cloud was so thick that the priests could not perform their service. Solomon stood before the altar in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven, and prayed one of the most beautiful prayers in Scripture. Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants who continue wholeheartedly in your way. You have kept your promise to your servant David, my father. With your mouth you have promised, and with your hand you have fulfilled it, as it is today. The prayer continues for pages. Solomon asks God to hear the prayers of his people, to forgive when they sin, to bless when they obey, to remain present in this house. And God answered. Fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and sacrifices. The glory of the Lord filled the temple. The people saw it and fell on their faces in worship. It was the high point of Solomon's reign. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was now complete and blessed by God's presence. If Solomon had died that day, he would be remembered as the greatest king Israel ever had. But Solomon did not die. He lived. And the life that followed would be a slow descent from that mountaintop into a valley of shadows. Because here is what Solomon did not understand yet. The ring was still on his finger. The demons were still bound to his service. And now that the temple was complete, what purpose did they serve? The logical thing would have been to release them, to give the ring back to God, to say thank you for the help. But I do not need this power anymore. But Solomon did not do that. He kept the ring, he kept the power, and he began to use it for other purposes, building his palace, building his empire, maintaining control. The line between servant and master was starting to blur. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see how power corrupts even the wisest people, because what happens next is not a sudden fall, it is a gradual slide. A series of small compromises, a growing belief that the rules that apply to everyone else do not apply to you. Solomon was about to learn what every leader eventually learns. Having power and using power wisely are two very different things. And the moment you start believing you are special, that you are above the rules, that your wisdom makes you immune to temptation, that is the moment you are in the most danger. Chapter 6. The Ring of Power. Let us be clear about what the ring represented. It was not magic in the pagan sense. Solomon was not a sorcerer casting spells or making potions. The ring's power came from the name of God inscribed on it. It was authority, not sorcery. But authority can be abused just as easily as magic can, maybe more easily, because it feels legitimate. When you are commanding demons in God's name, it does not feel like disobedience. It feels like service. And that is exactly what makes it so dangerous. The most destructive sins often come wrapped in righteous intentions. Ancient texts give us different versions of how Solomon used the ring after the temple was completed. Some say he used it to gather knowledge. He would summon demons and question them about the secrets of the universe, about the heavens and the depths, about the heavens and the depths, about treasures hidden in the earth. Solomon's wisdom was already supernatural, but now he was adding to it through forbidden means. Deuteronomy chapter 18 specifically forbids consulting with spirits, but Solomon rationalized. He was not consulting them for guidance, he was interrogating them for information. Surely that was different. Surely God would understand. Other texts say Solomon used the ring for entertainment. He would command demons to perform at his court, to display their powers, to amaze visiting dignitaries. Imagine a foreign king arriving in Jerusalem and witnessing Solomon command invisible forces to move objects, to create illusions, to demonstrate power that no other king possessed. It would have been impressive. It would have enhanced Solomon's reputation. It would have made Israel seem invincible. But it would also have been a lie, because the power was not Solomon's, it was borrowed. And borrowed power always comes with a price. Still, other traditions say Solomon used the ring to control people, not through direct demonic possession, but through subtle influence. Demons would whisper in the ears of Solomon's enemies, creating fear or confusion. They would manipulate circumstances to favor Solomon's plans. They would ensure that his wisdom always seemed to work, that his judgments always seemed to work, that his judgments always seemed perfect. And Solomon, brilliant man that he was, probably convinced himself that this was just efficient governance. Why rely on chance when you can control outcomes? Why risk failure when you have the tools to guarantee success? But here is what happens when you start controlling everything. You stop trusting God. You do not mean to. You still pray. You still sacrifice. You still say the right words. But deep in your heart, you are trusting the ring more than you are trusting the one who gave it to you. And that shift, that subtle reorientation of dependence, is the beginning of idolatry. Idolatry is not just bowing to statues. It is trusting anything other than God to secure your life. And Solomon was beginning to trust his own wisdom, his own power, his own ability to manipulate circumstances. The demons noticed. Of course they did. They were watching for exactly this, and slowly, carefully, they began to speak to Solomon differently. At first, they had been purely submissive. Yes, master. As you command, master. But over time, their tone changed. They began to offer suggestions. Master, if you want to accomplish this goal, perhaps you should consider this approach. Master, there is something you should know about your enemies. Master, we could help you even more if you would just allow us a little more freedom. The relationship was shifting. Solomon thought he was still in charge, but the demons were learning to lead by following. One demon in particular became Solomon's regular contact. Tradition gives him different names. Asmodeus in some texts, or Neas in others. The name does not matter as much as the role. This demon became something like an advisor. Solomon would summon him regularly to discuss plans, to gather intelligence, to solve problems. And the demon was brilliant. Of course he was. Demons are fallen angels, and angels are far more intelligent than humans. The demon could offer insights Solomon would never think of on his own, solutions to political problems, strategies for trade, warnings about threats, and every piece of advice was good. Every suggestion worked. Solomon was winning at every level, but the demon was patient. He did not need to lead Solomon into obvious sin. Not yet. He just needed to keep Solomon dependent. Keep him using the ring. Keep him using the ring. Keep him believing that this power was essential to his success. Because once you believe you need something, once you structure your life around it, giving it up becomes almost impossible. Solomon was building his entire reign on a foundation of controlled demonic power. And foundations determine everything. If your foundation is cracked, it does not matter how beautiful the building looks. Eventually, it will fall. 1 Kings chapter 9 records a second encounter between God and Solomon. God appeared to him again, just as he had at Gibeon. But this time, the tone was different. I have heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command, and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. Notice the if. God was giving a warning, not just a promise. But then came the darker half. But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. This temple will become a heap of rubble. Did Solomon hear the warning? Did he understand that God was speaking directly to the choices he was making? We do not know. The text does not tell us his reaction. But what we do know is that Solomon did not change course. He did not remove the ring. He did not release the demons. He continued building, accumulating, expanding. His wealth grew beyond measure. 1 Kings chapter 10 describes the Queen of Sheba's visit. She came with hard questions, and Solomon answered them all. She saw his wisdom, his palace, his officials, his sacrifices, and she was overwhelmed. The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true, she said, but I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth you have far exceeded the report I heard. Everything looked perfect, but perfection built on compromise is just an illusion waiting to shatter, and the cracks were already forming. They just were not visible yet, not to the Queen of Sheba, not to Solomon's officials, not even to Solomon himself, but they were there, in the secrets he kept, in the power he wielded, in the beings he commanded. The demons were waiting, and their patience was about to pay off. Comment below if you have ever felt like you were in control of something that was actually controlling you. Because that is where Solomon was. He thought he held the ring, but the ring was beginning to hold him. And the moment you realize you are not free, that you cannot let go, that you need the very thing that is destroying you, that is the moment you understand what slavery really means. Solomon was about to learn that lesson the hardest way possible. Chapter 7. Masters and Slaves. There is a moment in every addiction, every obsession, every slow enslavement, when you realize you are no longer choosing. You are being chosen. You think you are deciding to reach for the substance, the behavior, the power. But actually, it is reaching for you. And by the time you notice, the chains are already locked. Solomon was approaching that moment, but he did not see it coming because he was too distracted by success. His kingdom was prosperous. His reputation was legendary. Gold flowed into Jerusalem like water. 1 Kings chapter 10 tells us that the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones. Every 3 years, his trading ships returned with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and baboons. Kings from all over the world sought audience with Solomon to hear his wisdom. They brought tribute, they brought gifts, they brought their daughters as potential brides, and Solomon accepted. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 3 gives us the staggering number. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. These were not love matches, they were political alliances. Every wife represented a treaty with a foreign nation. Every marriage secured peace or trade agreements or military cooperation. Solomon thought this was wisdom. He was building an empire through diplomacy rather than war. He was creating a network of alliances that made Israel untouchable. No nation would attack if their princess was in Solomon's palace. No king would break trade agreements if his daughter's children might inherit part of Israel. It was brilliant strategy, but it violated God's command. Deuteronomy chapter 17 verse 17 says explicitly, "The king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray." Solomon knew this command, but he thought his wisdom made him immune. He thought he could marry foreign women without adopting foreign gods. He was wrong. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 4 tells us what happened. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. These are devastating words. The wisest man in history, the man who built God's temple, the man who received direct revelation from God, turned to worshipping demons. How does this happen? How does someone fall so far? The answer is that it does not happen all at once. It happens in stages. First, you compromise a little. You tell yourself it is necessary. You marry a foreign princess for political reasons. You allow her to bring her gods into the palace because forcing her to convert would offend her father, and you need that alliance. You build a small altar for her gods because it is just private worship, not public endorsement. You participate in a ceremony or two because refusing would cause diplomatic problems. Each step seems reasonable. Each compromise seems small, but compromises compound. Solomon did not wake up one day and decide to worship Molech. He woke up 10,000 days in a row and made small decisions that slowly bent his heart away from God. And the ring, the demons, the power he had been wielding all these years, they accelerated the process. Because here is what the texts do not explicitly say but strongly imply. The foreign gods Solomon's wives worshipped were not just idols, they were fronts for demonic powers, and Solomon already had relationships with demons. He had been commanding them for decades. So when his wives asked him to honor their gods, he was not being introduced to something foreign. He was being invited to formalize relationships he already had. This is the dark genius of demonic strategy. Demons do not usually appear as monsters. They appear as helpers. They solve your problems. They make you successful. They give you everything you think you want. And only after you are completely dependent, only after you have structured your entire life around their assistance, do they ask for worship. And by then, saying no feels impossible. Because you have convinced yourself that you need them, that you cannot succeed without them. That walking away means losing everything. Solomon was in that trap. The demons he had been commanding through the ring were no longer content to be servants. They wanted recognition. They wanted altars. They wanted sacrifices. And they used Solomon's wives as the leverage to get what they wanted. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 7 and 8. The man who built the temple of the Lord built altars to demons within sight of that temple. Think about the spiritual insanity of that moment. Solomon could stand on his palace roof and see both the temple of God and the altars of demons. He was trying to serve both, trying to maintain his relationship with God while also feeding his dependence on demonic power. And for a while, it seemed to work. The kingdom was still prosperous. God had not yet withdrawn his blessing. But inside, Solomon was being torn apart. Ecclesiastes, the book tradition attributes to Solomon's later years, is filled with despair. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. What has been will be again. There is nothing new under the sun. These are not the words of a happy man. These are the words of someone who has everything and realizes it is all empty, because that is what happens when you sell your soul for power. You get the power, but you lose yourself. You achieve your goals, but you destroy your peace. You impress the world, but you despise the face in the mirror. Solomon had become the richest, most famous, most successful king in the world, and he was miserable. The ring that once felt like a gift now felt like a shackle. The demons that once seemed like servants now felt like masters, and the God he once walked with now felt distant, silent, disappointed. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son." This was the sentence. Not immediate destruction, but inevitable collapse. Solomon would finish his reign, but everything he built would fall apart in the next generation. The United Kingdom would split, civil war would come, the Golden Age would end, and it would all be because Solomon thought he was wise enough to handle power that no human should ever touch. He thought he could use demons without being used by them. He thought he could compromise without consequences. He thought his wisdom made him special, and in thinking that, he became just like every other fool who has ever fallen. Like and subscribe if this story is hitting you harder than you expected, because we are not done yet. Solomon's fall is not the end. There is a bottom to hit, and Solomon has not hit it yet. The ring is still on his finger. The demons are still answering his commands, but the balance has shifted. Solomon thinks he is still the master, but anyone watching from the outside can see the truth. He is the slave, and slaves do not give orders, they take them. The question now is whether Solomon will realize this before it is too late, whether he can break free, or whether he will ride his pride all the way to destruction. Chapter 8. The temple rises, the soul descends. There is bitter irony in Solomon's situation. He built the greatest temple to God the world had ever seen, but in the process, he constructed a prison for his own soul. Every stone of the temple was perfect. Every measurement was exact. Every decoration was flawless. But while Solomon was building outward, something inward was crumbling. His connection to God, his integrity, his freedom. He was becoming a monument to the danger of doing the right things for the wrong reasons, all with the wrong methods. The temple stood as a testimony to God's presence, but the presence of God was withdrawing from the builder. God's glory had filled the temple at its dedication, but God's pleasure was departing from the king who built it. How can these two things exist at the same time? How can God bless the work while judging the worker? Because God is patient. Because God keeps his promises even when we break ours. Because God cares more about his people than about their leaders. The temple was for Israel, not for Solomon, and God would honor the temple even while disciplining the king. But Solomon was too busy to notice the growing distance. He had projects to complete, a kingdom to manage, wives to satisfy, demons to command. His days were full of activity but empty of meaning. Ecclesiastes chapter 2 captures this perfectly. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. Solomon tried everything: work, pleasure, achievement, wealth, knowledge, entertainment. He denied himself nothing his eyes desired. He refused his heart no pleasure, but the conclusion he reached is devastating. When I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. This is the testimony of a man who had access to everything the world offers and found it all empty. Why? Because he had lost the one thing that gives life meaning: connection to God, purpose beyond himself, freedom from the chains of his own making. The demons were tightening their grip. At first they had appeared only when summoned, but now they lingered. Solomon would see them in the shadows of his palace, hear their whispers in the night, feel their presence even when he was not using the ring. They were becoming part of his environment, part of his normal experience, and that normalization is how evil wins. When wickedness becomes ordinary, when corruption becomes routine, when you stop being shocked by your own behavior, you are in deep trouble. Solomon's counselors and officials noticed changes. The king was more irritable, more suspicious, more prone to harsh judgments. The wisdom that once produced justice now produced cynicism. Where he had once seen the best in people, he now assumed the worst. Where he had once listened carefully, he now made snap decisions. Where he had once been generous, he now hoarded power. These were not dramatic changes. Nobody could point to a specific moment when Solomon became someone different. But over time, the accumulation of small changes created a different man. His relationship with his sons suffered. 1 Kings tells us about only a few of Solomon's children, but he must have had many. With 700 wives and 300 concubines, the palace was full of princes and princesses. But Solomon had no time for them. He was too important, too busy, too distracted by the machinery of empire to invest in the souls of his children. And so his sons grew up with all the privileges of royalty, but none of the wisdom that should have come with it. They learned to expect power without earning it, to demand obedience without giving respect, to see people as tools rather than as image-bearers of God. Rehoboam, the son who would succeed Solomon, is the perfect example. When he becomes king, the people come to him with a simple request. Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. Rehoboam consults Solomon's old advisors, who tell him to be kind and the people will serve him forever. But then he consults his young friends, who tell him to be harsh, to show strength, to make the yoke even heavier, and Rehoboam chooses the bad advice. He threatens the people and they rebel. 10 tribes break away. The kingdom splits. And it all happens because Solomon never taught his son what really matters. But that is still in the future. For now, Solomon is old. His body is failing. His mind is still sharp, but his spirit is exhausted. He looks back at his life and sees accomplishment, the temple, the wealth, the empire, the legendary wisdom, but he also sees emptiness. The meaninglessness he wrote about in Ecclesiastes is not theoretical, it is personal. He has lived it, he has tried everything the world offers, and none of it satisfied. The question is whether he will realize what went wrong before it is too late, whether he will connect his misery to his compromise, whether he will understand that the ring on his finger is the chain around his soul. Late at night, in the private chambers of his palace, Solomon sometimes takes off the ring. He holds it in his palm. He looks at the seal engraved on it, the name of God, and he feels the weight of contradiction. This ring bears God's name, but the power it gives him has taken him away from God. How did that happen? How did a gift become a curse? How did authority become bondage? Solomon does not have answers. Or maybe he does have answers but cannot face them, because facing them would mean admitting he was wrong, admitting that his wisdom was not enough, admitting that he needed God's grace more than he needed supernatural power. And that admission is hard for a man like Solomon. He built his entire identity on being wise, on having answers, on solving problems, admitting that he is the problem, that his wisdom led him astray, that he needs help, feels like destroying himself. So instead, he puts the ring back on. He summons the demon. He goes through the motions. He maintains the illusion of control. But inside, he is screaming. Inside, he is dying. Inside, he knows the truth. He is not the master. He is the slave. And unless something changes, unless someone intervenes, he will die in chains. Share this with someone who is struggling with something they know they should let go of but cannot. Because Solomon's story is not ancient history, it is a mirror. We all have our rings, our sources of power that feel necessary but are actually destroying us, our compromises that seem small but compound into spiritual disaster, our successes that come at the cost of our souls, and the question is always the same. Will we recognize the trap before it is too late? Will we choose freedom over power? Will we let go of what is killing us, even if letting go feels like losing everything? Solomon was about to face that choice, but not on his own terms, not in his own time. Because when you will not free yourself, sometimes God sends someone to break your chains. And that someone was coming. A figure from outside the palace, outside the machinery of power, a voice that would speak truth Solomon did not want to hear. A choice that would determine not just Solomon's fate, but the fate of everyone who came after him. Chapter 9. Voices in the Dark. The demons were no longer hiding. They walked through Solomon's palace like courtiers. They attended his councils. They influenced his decisions. Solomon could see them now, not just sense them. Whether this was because his spiritual sight had changed or because they no longer bothered to disguise themselves is unclear, but the result was the same. The invisible realm had become visible, and what Solomon saw terrified him. The chief demon, the one who had become his regular contact, now spoke to Solomon with barely concealed contempt. The pretense of servitude was gone. "O wise king," the demon would say, dripping with sarcasm, "O master of earth and heaven, tell me what you command so that I may laugh as you pretend you still give orders." Solomon would rage at these insults. He would hold up the ring and shout commands, and the demon would obey, technically. But every action was slow. Every obedience came with a smirk. The power dynamic had reversed and both of them knew it. Solomon tried to break free. He tried going days without using the ring. But problems would arise that seemed to require demonic intervention. A foreign king would threaten war, and Solomon would need intelligence that only the demons could provide. A building project would stall, and Solomon would need supernatural labor to complete it on schedule. A court case would be too complex, and Solomon would need to see into hearts the way he used to be able to do naturally. But now, that gift was fading. His natural wisdom was being replaced by demonic assistance, and the more he relied on them, the less he could function without them. This is the nature of addiction. Whether to substances, to power, to approval, to control. At first, the thing you are addicted to enhances your life. It makes you perform better, feel better, cope better. But slowly, it replaces your natural capacities. Your body stops producing what it needs because the substance is providing it. Your mind stops solving problems because the addiction is providing solutions. And eventually, you are not using the thing anymore. You are dependent on it. You cannot function without it. And that is when it owns you. Solomon was owned, and the demons were preparing to cash in. They had waited decades for this moment. They had served patiently. They had made Solomon successful. They had given him everything he wanted, and now it was time to ask for payment. The chief demon came to Solomon one night. The king was alone in his chambers, staring at the ring. "My lord," the demon said, and the title was mocking, "we have served you faithfully. We have built your temple. We have enriched your kingdom. We have made you the greatest king on earth. Is it not time for you to honor us properly?" Solomon knew what the demon meant. Proper honor meant worship, meant sacrifices, meant public acknowledgement. And Solomon hesitated. He still remembered who he was. He still remembered the God of Israel. He still remembered the God of Israel. He still remembered his father David's Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd. I will fear no evil." How could he publicly worship demons? How could he betray everything he was raised to believe? But the demon pressed, "My lord, we do not ask for much. Just a small altar, just a few sacrifices, just recognition of the partnership we have shared. Surely that is fair." Fairness is the language of demons. They take your compromises and call them agreements. They take your slavery and call it partnership. They make you think that giving them what they want is reasonable, honorable, the right thing to do. And Solomon, exhausted and desperate and isolated, found himself nodding. "Yes, yes, you have served well. Yes, you deserve recognition. Yes, I will build altars." And with those words, the last pretense fell away. Solomon was no longer a king commanding demons. He was a puppet dancing on their strings. But not everyone in the kingdom was blind to what was happening. Prophets saw. Faithful priests saw. Ordinary people who still remembered what pure worship looked like saw. They watched in horror as Solomon, the great king, the wise king, the temple builder, erected altars to foreign gods on the hills around Jerusalem. They whispered among themselves, they prayed, and some of them spoke up. A prophet named Ahijah came to Jeroboam, one of Solomon's officials, and tore his own cloak into 12 pieces. He gave 10 pieces to Jeroboam and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes." The judgment was pronounced. The sentence was declared. But Solomon himself seemed not to care. He was too far gone, too compromised, too entangled in the web he had woven. He went through the motions of ruling. He sat on his throne. He rendered judgments. He managed his empire. But his heart was dead. His spirit was broken. He was alive, but not living. Successful, but not fulfilled. Powerful, but not free. He had everything the world values and nothing that makes life worth living. Late one night, something happened that would begin Solomon's path back. He was alone in his chambers. The ring was on his finger. The demons were silent, and in that silence, Solomon heard a voice, not the mocking voice of demons, not the accusing voice of his own conscience, but a different voice, gentle, sad, familiar, Son of David. Solomon froze. He knew that voice. He had heard it twice before, once at Gibeon, once after the temple dedication. It was the voice of God, and God was speaking again. "Son of David, why have you forsaken me?" The question cut deeper than any accusation. It was not angry, it was grieved. God was not asking for information. God was asking Solomon to see himself, to understand what he had done, to recognize the relationship he had abandoned. Solomon tried to answer, tried to justify, tried to explain, but no words came because there was no explanation that made sense, no justification that held up, no excuse that covered the magnitude of his betrayal. For a long moment, Solomon stood in silence, and in that silence, something cracked. Not dramatically, not with thunder or earthquake, but quietly. A crack in the armor he had built around his heart, a crack that let in light, and pain, and truth. And with that crack came tears. Solomon, the great king, wept. He wept for what he had lost, for who he had become, for the years he had wasted, for the gift he had abused. He wept until he had no tears left. And then, in the exhausted emptiness that followed, he heard the voice again. "There is a way back." Solomon looked up. "A way back? After everything I have done? After all the altars I built? After all the compromises I made?" The voice was firm but kind. "There is always a way back, but it will cost you everything. You must let go of the power you have clung to. You must remove the ring. You must renounce the demons. You must choose me over everything else. Can you do that?" Solomon looked at the ring on his finger, the ring that had defined his reign, the ring that had given him power beyond measure, the ring that had given him power beyond measure, the ring that had enslaved him. Could he let it go? Could he live without it? Could he trust God alone? That question hung in the air. And Solomon, for the first time in decades, did not have an answer. Comment below if you have ever faced a choice between what you need and what you want, because that is where Solomon was. He needed God. He wanted the ring. He needed freedom. He wanted power. He needed truth. He wanted the illusion of control. And he could not have both. Nobody can. We all reach that moment eventually, the moment where we have to choose. And the choice we make determines everything that follows. Solomon was standing at that crossroads, and what happened next would define not just the end of his story, but the legacy he would leave for generations to come. Chapter 10. The throne of thorns power isolated Solomon. The higher he climbed, the fewer people could reach him. His wives were political arrangements, not companions. His officials were subordinates, not friends. His sons were distant, raised by servants while he built empires. And the demons, the beings he had relied on for so long, were his captors, not his allies. Solomon was the most connected man in the world and the most alone. He sat on a throne of gold, but it felt like thorns. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 verse 9 through 12 reflects this loneliness. Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up, but pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. Solomon understood this truth intellectually. He had written these words, but he had not lived them. He had isolated himself through compromise, through pride, through the belief that he was special enough to walk alone. The voice of God had cracked something open in Solomon. But cracks do not heal quickly. Solomon was afraid of what letting go would mean, afraid of living without the power he had depended on, afraid of facing his people, his family, himself, without the armor of supernatural control. So he delayed. He told himself he would deal with it later. He told himself he needed to prepare. He told himself that removing the ring required the right moment, the right circumstances. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was afraid of being ordinary. That fear is common to anyone who has tasted power. Whether it is political power, financial power, social power, or spiritual power. Once you have it, once you know what it feels like to control outcomes, to bend circumstances to your will, to make things happen by force of will, giving it up feels like dying. Because in a sense, it is. The person you were with, power dies, and you have to become someone new, someone weaker, someone more dependent, someone more human. And that transformation is terrifying. The demons sensed Solomon's hesitation. They pressed their advantage. They appeared to him more frequently. They reminded him of all they had done for him. They warned him of what would happen if he betrayed them. My Lord, you know what we are capable of. You know the forces we command. You know the chaos we could unleash. Do you really want to make enemies of us? Do you really want to walk away from this partnership? Think carefully, wise king. Think about what you are risking. These threats worked because they played on Solomon's deepest fear. Not fear of physical harm, not fear of death, but fear of loss. Fear of losing the kingdom he had built. Fear of losing the kingdom he had built. Fear of losing his reputation. Fear of losing the comfort and security and control that power provided. And so Solomon stayed paralyzed, knowing what he should do but unable to do it, hearing God's voice but refusing to obey, wanting freedom but clinging to chains. This paralysis lasted for months, maybe years. The text does not give us a clear timeline, but we know that Solomon's later years were marked by increasing political instability. Enemies arose that had not troubled him before. Hadad the Edomite, Rezon son of Iyada, Jeroboam son of Nebat. 1 Kings chapter 11 lists them. These were not random occurrences, they were consequences. God was removing his protection. God was allowing Solomon to feel the weight of his choices, not out of cruelty, but out of mercy. Sometimes the only way to wake someone up is to let them experience the consequences of their behavior. Solomon felt those consequences. His advisors brought him reports of unrest. His military commanders warned of threats. His economic ministers noted declining revenues. The golden age was ending, and everyone knew it. The question on everyone's mind was why? Why was everything falling apart? What had changed? And Solomon knew the answer even if nobody else did. He had changed. His relationship with God had changed, and when that foundation cracked, everything built on it began to crumble. One day an old man appeared at the palace gates. He was not a prophet, not a priest, not anyone official, just an old man who asked to see the king. The guards tried to turn him away, but something about him made them hesitate. His eyes held a weight, a seriousness that demanded respect. So they brought him to Solomon. The old man stood before the throne. He did not bow. He simply looked at Solomon with sad, knowing eyes. "You are the king who talks to demons," the old man said. His voice was quiet but clear. Solomon stiffened. "How do you know about that?" The old man smiled, but it was a smile of grief, not joy. "Everyone knows, Your Majesty. They may not speak of it openly, but they know. They see the altars, they hear the rumors, they feel the change in the kingdom. And they are afraid. Afraid of what you have become, afraid of where you are leading them." Solomon felt anger rising. "Who are you to speak to me this way? Who are you to judge?" The old man did not flinch. "I am nobody. Just an old man who remembers what this kingdom used to be, who remembers your father David, who remembers the day you asked God for wisdom. I am here to ask you a question." "What question?" Solomon demanded. The old man stepped closer. "At what point does a wise man become a fool?" Solomon had no answer. The old man continued. "When does a gift become a curse? When does a servant become a master? When does a king become a slave?" "You know the answers, Solomon. You have always known, you just have not been willing to face them. The ring on your finger is not a tool. It is a chain. The demons you command are not your servants. They are your owners. And the power you think is holding your kingdom together is actually tearing it apart." Solomon wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself. But the words would not come, because everything the old man said was true, and denying truth does not make it false. It just makes you a liar. So Solomon sat in silence, and the old man spoke again, this time even more gently. "It is not too late. You can still choose differently. But you must choose soon, because the longer you wait, the harder it becomes. The chains grow heavier with time, and eventually they become impossible to break." With those words, the old man turned and walked out of the throne room. Solomon watched him go. He wanted to call him back, wanted to ask more questions, wanted to know who he was and where he came from. But he did not. He just sat on his throne, staring at the ring on his finger, feeling its weight for the first time in years. And in that moment, something shifted. Not dramatically, not completely, but enough. Enough to begin. Subscribe if you want to know whether Solomon found the courage to change. Because we are entering the final movements of the story, the crisis is here, the choice is clear, and what Solomon does next will determine whether his story ends in redemption or tragedy. The ring is on his finger, the demons are waiting, God is calling, and Solomon, old and tired and broken, must decide who he really is. Is he the slave who serves demons, or is he the son of David who serves the living God? He cannot be both, and the time for choosing has come. Chapter 11. When demons become masters. The night after the old man left, Solomon could not sleep. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling. The ring felt hot on his finger. He could hear whispers in the darkness. The demons were restless. They sensed something changing. They had worked too hard, waited too long to lose Solomon now. And so they came to him, not one, but many. They filled his chamber like smoke, and their voices overlapped into a chorus of accusation and threat. "You cannot leave us, Solomon. You need us. Without us, you are nothing. Without us, your kingdom falls. Without us, your enemies will destroy you. Without us, you are just a frightened boy pretending to be a king. Remember Gibeon? Remember how weak you were. Remember how you begged God for help because you knew you could not do it alone. Nothing has changed. You are still that boy. Still weak, still helpless, but we made you strong, we made you great, we made you wise, and you dare think of betraying us?" Solomon pulled the blankets over his head like a child hiding from monsters, but the voices did not stop. They came through the fabric, through the walls, through his own mind, and underneath the threats, Solomon heard something else: fear. The demons were afraid. They were afraid of losing control. Afraid of what Solomon might do if he truly chose God. Afraid of being cast out, cast down, cast back into whatever pit they had crawled from. And that fear gave Solomon something he had not felt in years: hope. If they are afraid, Solomon thought, then maybe I do have power. Not the power of the ring, but the power of the ring. But the power of choice, the power to say no, the power to walk away. The demons could threaten, they could intimidate, they could make life difficult, but ultimately, they could not force him to obey. They needed his consent. They needed his cooperation. And if he withdrew it, if he chose to release them despite the cost, they would have to leave. Because that is the rule. Demons can tempt, but they cannot possess without invitation. And Solomon, despite all his compromise, had never fully given himself to them. He had used them, relied on them, but he had not worshipped them, not truly, not in his heart. That realization gave Solomon courage. He sat up in bed, he spoke into the darkness. "Get out." The whispers stopped. Silence, then laughter. Dark, mocking laughter. "You cannot dismiss us, wise king. You are bound to us. We are bound to you. The ring connects us. And you will never take it off because you are too afraid of what life looks like without it." Solomon's hand moved to the ring. He touched it, felt the metal, warm and alive under his fingers. The demon was right. He had never seriously considered removing it. But what if he did? What if he simply pulled it off and threw it away? Before he could talk himself out of it, Solomon yanked the ring off his finger. The moment it left his skin, pain exploded through his body. It felt like being torn apart. The demons screamed. Solomon screamed. The room filled with light and darkness at the same time, swirling together in chaos. Solomon fell to the floor, clutching his hand. The ring rolled across the stone floor, and for a moment, Solomon could see it glowing with unnatural light. Then the light faded. The darkness faded. The screaming stopped, and Solomon lay on the floor in silence, breathing hard, his hand throbbing. He had done it. He had removed the ring, and he was still alive, but barely. His body felt weak, like he had been sick for weeks. His mind felt foggy, and when he tried to stand, his legs would not support him. He collapsed back to the floor. The door to his chamber burst open. Servants rushed in. They found the king lying on the floor, pale and shaking. They carried him to his bed. They called for physicians, but none of them knew what was really wrong. How could they? The sickness was not physical, it was spiritual. Solomon was in withdrawal. His body, his mind, his soul